Good afternoon, I think. Welcome, Unit 2. My name is Beth Ratway. I'm a senior TA consultant at the American Institutes for Research. John?
Well, good afternoon. My name is John DeLoach. I am the senior staff attorney for the South Carolina Association of Counties.
Hi, Oregon. I'm Sue Leeson, Senior Justice, Oregon Supreme Court.
And we'd like to hear a little bit about you.
Good afternoon, judges. We are Unit 2, and today we'll be discussing how the framers created the Constitution. We'd like to thank you all for being here. We'd also like to thank our coaches, Michael Millender and Todd Bauman, our teacher, Sadie Adams, and our mentor, Leah Alper. My name is Byrony.
My name is Charlotte.
My name is Claire.
My name is Hazel.
My name is Luca. Thank you. We're now ready for your question.
Okay, I'm ready to give it to you. So Unit 2, question 1. What were the major disagreements among the 55 delegates during the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and how were they resolved? What issues, if any, were not resolved, and what were the consequences? What changes, if any, should be made to the Constitution? We're ready.
The delegates disagreed over many issues relating to the presidency. The Articles of Confederation did not provide for an executive, in part due to the colonists' experience with royal abuses of power.
However, the weaknesses of the national government under the Articles of Confederation led many delegates, such as Madison and Hamilton, to favor a strong, energetic executive. Other delegates, such as Edmund Burke, were suspicious of a unitary executive, arguing that it would contain the fetus of monarchy.
The Virginia Plan called for an executive elected by the national legislature, but it was vague regarding the powers of this executive. The New Jersey Plan proposed an executive composed of several persons appointed by Congress. The delegates eventually vested executive power in a single person, the president, and gave the president a limited veto over legislation.
The most contentious issue in designing the executive branch was how the president would be elected. The delegates ultimately decided on a college of electors who would be independent of Congress and appointed by the states.
Another major debate at the convention was over the apportionment of representation in Congress. Delegates from large states argued that each state's representation should be in proportion to their population, while delegates from small states argued that each state should have equal representation.
The Committee of 11 resolved this issue with the Great Compromise, which provided that there would be two houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The representation would be proportional in the House and equal in the Senate.
Delegates also disagreed on whether and how slaves should be counted for apportionment purposes. The Southern delegates argued that slaves should be counted as full persons, while the Northern delegates argued that slaves should not be counted at all.
This disagreement was resolved by the 3/5 Compromise. It stated that a slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of apportioning representatives in the House and direct taxes among the states.
The delegates conceded to the power of the Southern states by adopting the Fugitive Slave Clause and protecting the importation of slaves for 20 years. However, the delegates did not address or resolve the constitutional.
The delegates could easily have foreseen that slavery would become a problem as the country expanded. After all, Article 4, Section 3 provided Congress with the power to admit new states. And the Northwest Ordinance mandated that slavery would not be allowed in the states and territories of the Old Northwest.
However, the Constitution was completely silent on the status of slavery in the Western territories. In the 19th century, this unresolved issue ultimately led to the Civil War.
Lastly, we suggest two changes to the U.S. Constitution. Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights grants everyone the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and of their families, including a right to medical care.
Our federal government has left this promise unfulfilled. Protecting a positive right to accessible medical care in the Constitution would preserve the inalienable right to life outlined by the Declaration of Independence.
We also propose that the Constitution impose limits on executive orders. The president's reliance on executive orders has grown dramatically in the recent decades. President Biden signed more executive orders in his first day Washington did in his entire presidency.
Article 1 states, all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in Congress. The executive is meant to be an enforcer and not a maker of laws. While Congress can pass a bill that counteracts an executive order, the president can veto such a bill.
To keep legislative and executive power separate and balanced, we suggest a constitutional amendment. Can I please finish my sentence?
Mhm.
Yeah, that prohibits the president from vetoing bills that undo executive orders. Thank you. We're now ready for your questions.
Thank you. John?
All right. Let me ask a fundamental question. Is it time for a constitutional convention to do wholesale amendment or even write an entirely new constitution?
A second constitutional convention could be beneficial to update some of the amendments that the founders believed would still apply today, but don't as much. For example, the Electoral College.
To add on to my colleague Luca, this would fit in with Thomas Jefferson's view of a living constitution, where the Constitution was changed via constitutional convention every several years, so that it best represented the interests and ideas of the people at the time.
To respectfully disagree with my colleagues, to open a constitutional convention would allow for many changes to be made to the Constitution. However, the political polarization that we currently see in the American political system leads to believe that not much would be able to be done in the bipartisanship that we're seeing today. So a constitutional convention in this respect could potentially be obsolete.
Adding on to what my colleague Barney said, with our system today, most of the problems are internal, specifically with political parties. These problems could be more solved through legislation than a constitutional convention. The Constitution is more a framework of government where legislation fills in the cracks.
One of the questions that the convention sort of kicked forward was resolution of the slavery issue. Those compromises did not resolve the issue. Would it have been preferable for the convention to try to solve the problem then rather than kicking it down the road? Because as you point out, they could see the problem was only going to get worse as the country grew. Or were they smart to have left it as they did?
The disagreement over slavery in the Constitutional Convention itself was large. Some delegates from southern states supported slavery, whereas others didn't, such as Madison saying he thought it wrong to admit that slavery was constitutional. So in that respect, they shouldn't have tried to abolish or do anything with it because there was so much internal disagreement.
Adding on to what my colleague Claire just spoke on, slavery was also very prevalent in the Southern economy. And if the Constitution was to outlaw slavery or to make any significant moves upon slavery, then there would have been an outcry from Southern states and putting forth whether the Constitution itself would have been ratified.
So just to push you a little bit on that, the same problem of the Southern economy without slavery was present in the 19th century. The South was devastated by the Civil War and the economic changes that came about as a result. Better to have that happen in the 19th century than the 18th?
With a weak national government, our federal government would have not been able to help the Southern states in their financial systems under the Articles of Confederation. So therefore, pushing it until we have a strong, powerful national government was more beneficial.
Thank you.
Adding on to what my colleague Charlotte just spoke on, the current government system was the Articles of Confederation, which lacked a strong federal government, executive power, and even in some places, legislative power and the ability to even change the articles themselves. So in this respect, if we had pushed forward, or if the founders had pushed forward the idea of abolishing slavery in the Constitution, then both the America itself would have been ill-equipped to handle a civil war at that time.
to respectfully disagree with my colleagues, but if the framers had addressed the issue of slavery more fully at the Constitutional Convention, it could have prevented the Civil War and its deaths through proactive action instead of leaving the disagreements to fester.
Thank you.
Thank you. You ended your presentation with the concept of a constitutional amendment in terms of the executive. Can you talk me through what that would look like? And is that the best way to address that change?
There are two main ways to get rid of executive orders. The judicial branch can have a court case brought to them and they can overturn the executive order, or the legislative can pass a bill. However, the difficulty with the latter is that the executive is able to veto that bill. The difficulty there is that it overturns the separation of powers. It makes it so that the executive can use legislative power and then get away with it by vetoing legislation.
Adding on to what my colleague just spoke on, the more internal problem of this overuse of executive orders is the fact that the legislature is experiencing a lot of congressional deadlock, which is stopping them from being able to move through bills succinctly. So in this respect, we could also solve this through changing the legislature and abolishing clauses such as Rule 22 in the Senate, which allows for the filibuster.
And you want to do this through a constitutional amendment?
Our constitutional amendment would be to limit the veto ability of the president, as set out in Article 1, to veto bills that pertain to executive orders. So in this respect, we would have to create a constitutional amendment if we were to pass the amendment that we proposed and are prepared.
If part of the problem is with executive orders is the slowness of Congress itself, would it be beneficial to just eliminate the U.S. Senate and have the legislative process consolidated in a single house?
A bicameral legislature is very important in our system because it has checks and balances and represents a variety of views. The House of Representatives represents the views of the population as a whole, whereas the Senate represents the views of the states. This creates a more diverse view, and this is very important in making legislation. Therefore, even with congressional deadlock, we should not eliminate the Senate.
To disagree with my colleague, a unicameral legislation does prevent a lot of deadlock, and that can be extremely helpful in passing bills.
Curious how your proposal on executive orders doesn't just reduce the country to nothing happens. Congress has proven to be so dysfunctional for so long. And that's not that I endorse the incredible growth of executive power. I find it amazingly frustrating. But how do we kickstart some life back into Congress?
Well, you're going to have to do that over coffee because right now they're at time.
All right.
It's a good question to think about. Thank you.
Okay, judges, we do have some time for some feedback if you'd like to give feedback to the students.
Okay, thank you. John, would you like to start?
Sure. I thought you were very good in that you presented yourselves well. You presented your arguments well. There were good reasoning, and that the application to the Constitution itself was very good.
Thank you. Sue?
Yeah, I think you did a really good job with an incredibly difficult question. And I appreciate the fact that you jumped in and you answered the question. You addressed each of the points, and often that doesn't happen. Where I would push you is to think about the worst possible corruption of all the proposals that you make, because that's how we have to learn to think politically. What's the worst thing that could happen if what I propose actually occurs? And you're really going to make me think hard about not only the introduction of a positive right into the Constitution for what I think would be the first time, really dramatic change in the view of what constitutes limited government, as well as the limitation on the use of executive orders. I just don't know where those might lead us in terms of interpretation. But that's not to say they're not good proposals and worth thinking about. So I really appreciate that. The other thing I appreciate in your presentation is the idea that perhaps what we need is more good legislation than constitutional amendment. The system could work if we tried. We've chosen not to let it work. So I love going away from a presentation with lots to think about, and you have done that. Thank you.
I agree. Thank you, ladies, for a wonderful presentation. Really thought out. I could see the flow and how you were answering the questions to begin with, throwing in some different components, some constitutional application throughout. I too starred the positive rights component, and you did address that it was a positive right. So thank you for addressing that versus a negative. I would like to think about that and talk about that for a while, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a whole different beast than it would be within our Constitution. But it was definitely food for thought, and that's what you want to do in these presentations, especially if you make Sue Leeson think about things, then you that's a win. Executive orders. We could have talked all day about that, but yes, really thinking about what's the best way. And you talked about good legislation and then constitutional amendment. We just got to the end of your presentation at that. And then you really started unpacking the concept of filibuster and more about executive orders. And I liked that. I think I would just push you a little bit to think about the components that you talked about in your presentation and their applicability today. And I think you started to think about that within our follow-ups, but just giving more examples and more evidence of how this can happen, really getting at what Sue had talked about, like thinking about worst case scenario, but how do you make sure that doesn't happen? And thinking through that. So I think you ladies should be very proud. Your teachers should be very proud, and your parents.
I agree.
And you did it. You did it. Thank you.
May I throw in one little nit for you to go check on factually? I think when it came to the question of slave states and non-slave states on how to count slaves for purposes of representation, the non-slave states had to do a complete contradiction to their position. And it was the South that wanted full count so that it would have more representation in Congress. But check that out, and I may have misheard you, but that to me is one of the really fun depends getting a twist at the convention in terms of principles.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
questions. They were really interesting.
You can
I really
continue
enjoyed
talking
them.
about them together and at home with your parents.
Yes, thank you. We appreciate you guys taking the time to judge us today. And this was a great experience for the whole team. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
Good.
Hey,